We've talked a bit in the past about how the sector just needs space to breathe and to scope the change ahead. And of course, the one thing that we're missing is space to breathe and time to think. Jim's a writer on organisational performance, on emerging social trends and their impact on leadership, and on management and contemporary organisation. He's an editorial board member in the Journal of Applied Behavioural Science, Organisational and Social Dynamics and Socioanalysis. Jim is a past president of the International Society for the Psychological Study of Organisation and a fellow of the AK Institute in the US. His practice is informed by 4 principles: that organisations are shaped jointly by social and technical forces, that they exist in increasing dynamic and unstable environments, that clarity of objectives and tasks provide an essential basis for high performance, and adapting to emerging conditions requires people in organisations to learn from experience.
Tonight, I want to focus on 2 social forces that are on a collision course. In some places, they've already collided, and in the resulting sparks, I believe we can see bits and pieces of the future. One is the changing nature of organizations in our information-based, globalized, networked world. The other is the further education and skills sector itself. The point of intersection has to do with what kind of organizations will enable FE institutions to take advantage of the opportunities now before it, and in particular, what this intersection means for how we think about leading these institutions. Leadership plays a vital role in how we confront the future. It is widely believed that the quality of our lives depends on the quality of our leadership. We yearn for leaders to articulate and sustain a compelling image of the future and promise us a safe tomorrow. Leadership is now seen by many as the single most important issue facing modern organizations. More pressing now than developing management skills, strategic planning, change management capabilities, or diversity awareness, or what have you. While success may depend on new technologies, global thinking, continuous improvement, superior service, and so forth, our leaders are meant to make it all happen. A vast industry has grown for finding, training, developing, supporting, and fixing leaders. Countless graduate programs and undergraduate courses focus on leadership. Business schools center their missions on turning out leaders, and an endless array of seminars, conferences, speeches, and books are offered by leadership experts. Though it's such a looming and important issue, it's trying to say something useful about leadership is very tricky and difficult. Though inherently collective, leadership is deeply personal. Our feelings about it are often unbeknownst to us, richly colored by our early life experiences. It's one of those slippery terms that comes to mean everything and nothing with countless connotations and people talking past one another. Often, we're left with little more than cliches and bromides and empty platitudes. Actually, while writing this talk, I kept remembering a story of a banquet of a very distinguished institution. And the two giants in the field who were mortal enemies gave opening remarks. The first distinguished speaker named Kernberg, gets up and gives a perfectly constructed, beautifully reasoned, exquisitely formulated statement. His archenemy, Michaels, goes to the podium. I, too, have nothing to say. Of course, context really matters and naturally frustrates any search for the timeless qualities. The wider social, economic, and technological context is the stage on which the drama of leadership plays out. In earlier, more stable times, leaders led by providing good, solid management, define purposes, embody them in programs, handle conflict, defend the institutional boundaries. But then the greater complexity and global interconnectedness and environmental turbulence that we often refer to as post-industrialism led to a brand new outlook. Management and leadership are different. Managers do things right, leaders the right things. Planning, budgeting, organizing, staffing, problem solving is what managers do. They provide order. Leaders, on the other hand, are about change. Leadership requires vision, defining the future, aligning people with and resources with that future, and getting them to create it. Leaders bring about change. They are transformational. And those who transform their organizations become public heroes and role models against which others are measured. Still, something's missing. We still don't really understand all that much about leadership. And one of the overriding premises that cuts across all of these categories and all these theories and all these models is that leadership exists inside of that sack of skin that we call the person. Leadership is exercised by individuals who influence others based on some combination of position and special qualities, and that the leader holds the key to performance. This evening, I want to propose that this way of thinking about leaders may no longer serve us very well. I'm not so sure it ever did, but I think it's decidedly so now as we try to build organizations suited to the emerging 21st century landscape. Many believe, as do I, that the idea of the dynamic leader looking over the horizon, discerning the correct direction, and guiding the ship is becoming an outmoded myth, and actually oftentimes stands in the way of what needs to be done. It can be an idea used defensively for safety rather than confronting the complex, confusing realities that we actually face today. The darker view, which I believe also warrants consideration, is that the singular focus on the leader can become a kind of collective escape from responsibility. So what I would like to consider with you is that we may be looking for leadership in the wrong place. What I am suggesting is turning the usual question on its head and considering leadership or leadership capability as an outcome or an output of the system, rather than as an input or as a starting condition. We're highly attuned to how leaders in high position affect their organizations, but generally far less aware of how the organization shapes the leader. The most vivid illustration, of course, are times of crisis when a special context somehow conjures up heroic, inspirational leaders. In Churchill's words, "I was not the lion, but it fell to me to give the lion's roar." Or how in the world, in the rubble of Ground Zero, Rudy Giuliani was transformed overnight from this mean-spirited, vindictive, small-minded, lame-duck mayor into a compassionate, larger-than-life, embracing, clear-minded leader who provided great clarity and strength for all of us who were breathing the dust of Muhammad Atta. Churchill in a baseball cap, one journalist called him. Since then, he's reverted to the same spiteful, mean-spirited, small-minded person we knew before. How does this happen? What forces are at play? The same is true for the more commonplace organizations. I remember a study that impressed me so much when I was a graduate student about organizations that diagnosed their problem as not having a charismatic leader. So they went out and they did whatever it took to hire a search firm or whatever it took, and they got themselves charismatic leaders, and then it turned out the leaders were not so charismatic in their new place. I think we see this kind of thing all the time, that leaders who appear to have particular characteristics, when they're in a different setting, they look different. And so lots of things that we attribute to the person actually is more a result of the context in which they're in. So I believe we're entering a time in which the rewards will go to organizations that figure out how to foster this leadership throughout. Those that don't rely on the godlike leaders at the top. The systemic view of leadership is about what enables people to exercise leadership in their own roles, wherever they are in the pecking order. This idea about shared leadership has its own roots in the history of leadership studies. It can be traced back to the realization that leadership occurs only really in the context of relationships. It's based on the recognition that personality or authority or power in themselves are insufficient for leadership. Others have to come along, and not just compliantly. Elsewhere, I've written about the theme of leadership and betrayal in Henry IV. In the same play, Shakespeare makes a similar point when Glendower brags, "I can call spirits from the vasty deep." Hotspur's snide response, "Why, so can I, or so can any man, but will they come when you do call them?" If leadership resides in a relationship, then followers and leaders are jointly producing it together. What bonds them is a mutual purpose. Leadership becomes an artifact of that interaction, an aspect of the whole that is greater than the sum of the parts. From this standpoint, the language of leader and follower seems to be a bit quaint. It also confronts us with the profound dependence on one another. Leaders need followers, and followers leaders to produce leadership. With the sheer and overwhelming complexity we see today, which is just the beginning, I think, the breathtaking rates of change and so many boundaries in liquid flux, the idea of distributed leadership and its underlying concepts have become what Don Schoen, a teacher of mine, calls an idea in good currency. This refers to the life cycle of ideas, and they reach a point of acceptance and they stimulate change when they actually express important underlying realities. The reason I'm bringing this up is that it has to do with the second main trajectory on this crash course, which has to do with further education itself. I'm just using further education and FE to include further education and skills. I think that this training, further education and skills training, are also becoming ideas in good currency. I realize this might seem implausible or even laughable in the current climate or in the face of the recently announced 24% budget cuts in the skills area. But this is my proposition, and I'm sticking with it as a longer structural matter. Regardless of all the wonderful work FE institutions and our own community colleges do, they've languished in the minds of in the public mind, a kind of ambiguous intermediate state between two clearly defined and highly valued institutions, universally embraced primary education and the iconic status of the four-year university. It's described by Sir Andrew Foster in some of the materials I was sent as the neglected middle child. The ambivalence about these institutions is undoubtedly grounded in many sources, including that they tend to be repositories of uncomfortable feelings, feelings about the inadequacy of our school systems, feelings about underachievers, linked with aspirations for and disappointment with sons and daughters, feelings about those in need of a second chance, about poverty, and the complex feelings around our immigrant populations. Now, however, there is a new aura of hope in the air. Community college is becoming an idea in good currency as our policymakers see the role that they play in the vitality of our society and in our economy in the way it's developing. The best evidence for this good currency is that President Obama recently proposed that for the first 2 years of community college be made universally available for free. Listen carefully to how he frames it. Now is the time to build a firmer, stronger foundation for growth that will not only withstand future economic storms, but one that helps us thrive and compete in a global economy. It's time to reform our community colleges so they provide Americans of all ages a chance to learn the skills and knowledge necessary to compete for the jobs of the future. The sector is coming into focus as a hinge of adaptation. So why all of this now? I think there are two reasons, both of which were mentioned really in that quote of Obama's. One is the looming issue of income equality and poverty. The other is about the changing nature of employment. I want to touch briefly on them. Income inequality, wage stagnation, and the relative decline in middle-class prosperity is now a big preoccupation in Washington on both sides of the aisle. Of course, the right and the left have different explanations, but nevertheless, the statistics about wage growth are stunning and deeply sobering. Community colleges, and it's been clearly demonstrated that our community college system is hands down the best anti-poverty program in existence. People are noticing this. The second driver for the good currency has to do with the economic transformation underway. The reasons behind it are familiar to all of us. Globalization, technological change, immigration patterns, rise of knowledge work, decrease in workers' bargaining power, and so forth. Entire segments, as we know, of workers become obsolete overnight. There are three qualities that, in my mind, foster the leadership-rich behavior needed for the networked ecosystems of today. I call them enrollment, conversation, and containment. First, enrollment. We empower our students to be productive citizens by giving them the skills and knowledge to succeed, often what it takes to break out of difficult circumstances. Same idea is often used to describe what is needed in organizations, to be entrepreneurial, proactive. Employees need to be empowered. I understand that Lady Gaga was put forward as a model for leadership in the further education sector. I'd like to propose a related but in some ways opposite frame. Empowering suggests freeing people from constraints. Rather, I believe that we need to help people join more deeply by occupying their roles more fully and more vitally. Instead of empowering, we need to enroll them. By role, I refer, of course, not to position, but to the part of the larger task that people carry forward with them. Enabling people to discover or create meaning in their part of the overall effort. The shared task is the foundation on which leadership is built. Shared purpose is what binds people. Enrolling, being fully enrolled, is the way that systemic leadership comes into being. Without shared purpose or task, leaders and followers can't find each other in a deeply connected way. Without it, community becomes hollow and ritualistic. Leaders and followers carry out disconnected work, and the result is obedience, compliance, passionless engagement, and depressed people in high position, not leadership. Supporting people to make this connection between their roles and the overall purposes and missions is what brings roles to life. Aligning roles with larger purposes involves tapping into the institution in the mind, as David Armstrong has so richly helped us understand. The link with the broader world is a vitally important sense of community and citizenship. And of course, as the great poet Neruda says, be careful how you see the world. It is that way, you know. So, what is my role? Do I carry a block of stone all day? Or am I building a cathedral? Do I turn a bolt with a spanner? Or am I protecting my community by producing jet planes? To make institutional purposes personal involves the kind of discourse that another of my mentors, Eric Trist, referred to as reappreciating or reframing challenging situations. This is part of the task of leadership today. And of course, engagement of students is one of the key challenges in community college student success. It may go without saying that enrolling teachers more fully will support the fuller enrollment of students as well, and help them see beyond what is often experienced as the stone lugging and bolt turning of being in school. Okay, conversation. Finding those connections between the personal and the institutional, and reframing purposes in ways that stimulate connection requires conversation. It relies on environments in which people are learning from their experience, from each other, from customers, from students, partners. Learning happens through conversation, and it emerges through relationship. It turns out that authentic, integrated, meaningful conversation is a crucial asset. And it's equally fundamental to creating and leading in these ecosystems that our entities are now coming to resemble. Knitting together different groups and institutions involves getting people and individuals with different definitions of the problem to incorporate one another's perspective. It requires ability to face contradiction. It takes a lot of conversation. The water plant engineer whose job now requires a higher certification, talking with his neighbor who works at Con Ed, Consolidated Electric, also needs certification. His wife works at the local community college. That conversation leads to a new arrangement between the three institutions. Or whatever conversation it was that brought about a fascinating project here, where the learning process has been reorganized so that the chemistry students work with the hairdressing students and with local businesses to develop new products. That took a lot of conversation. This is, by the way, one of the ways I appreciate the wisdom of FETL's mission. Its aim is to strengthen the leadership of thinking in further education, not thinking about leadership, but the leadership of thinking, a subtle but crucial difference which suggests that the need is not to have new orthodoxies and new formulas, but new forms of conversation and engagement, to give thinking a greater role in leadership and to support leadership as a reflective practice. Containment. The anxieties connected with change pose a constant threat to our ability to adapt, to discern futures, and to join with new ways of thinking. A key leadership function is the containment of these anxieties so they don't erode the capacity for creative thought and action. We live in a time when our organizations are deeply vulnerable, even to existential anxieties, with primitive emotional dynamics that all too often lead to things such as paralyzing interpersonal conflict and resistant dependency and what have you. The loss of dependable boundaries is often fought against, also something that I learned from David Armstrong, by people adhering to, in the mind, to the hierarchical models of organizations and their environments, further aggravating the difficulties of working in the horizontal, cross-functional, fragmented social ecologies around us. And the conventional means of containing disruptive emotional dynamics from the industrial era are no longer available to us. They relied on stable boundaries and small group formations. New forms of containment are needed to support authentic conversation, group innovation, and fostering ordinary human discourse about important organizational matters. What Winnicott describes as a holding environment, one that provides a space for processing experience, is vital under our emerging conditions. This isn't necessarily or at all about creating these conversations. They're occurring. It's finding them in our organizations, in our ecosystems, and joining with them and building on them. But it also requires leaders who possess the emotional capacity to tolerate the uncertainty, the frustration, and the pain without getting too anxious themselves. It's easy to be enthralled by heady new ideas of leadership, systemic transformation, new forms of community, all coming together around meaningful purpose. And at the same time, it's really important to be mindful of the potential damage caused by what we call pie in the sky thinking. As another one of my mentors, Isabel Mingus Life, pointed out, unrealistic or excessively idealistic missions lead to anti-task cultures. So the policymakers and politicians that comprise our authorizing environments will play such an instrumental role in what is possible. I believe there are many reasons for optimism that further education is becoming an idea in good currency and will gather political support around it. But at the same time, there's no shortage of reasons for discouragement. Navigating between the despair and demoralization on one hand and the grandiose, unrealistic hopes on the other, to be sure, is an important part of leadership for everybody involved. I come away from this wonderful opportunity to explore these issues by thinking there are many forces supporting the possibility of creative development for the sector, its institutions, and most importantly, for its students. Especially if we can find ways for people throughout the enterprise to fully occupy their roles and find the overlap between their personal passions and the higher purposes of further education and skills institutions. Thank you very much.
In a moment, I'll ask for comments, observations, responses from the audience. But while you're collecting your thoughts, I'd just like to give my own very personal and very raw response to what Jim said. And you can see how raw it is because I've been scribbling notes on a scrap of paper. I think as a serving principle, I found your lecture to be very relevant, Jim, despite your concerns about the potential US bias. I think it shows the truth of the interconnected world that we live in, that things resonate. And certainly I feel that I'm currently mired in what you call the complex, confusing realities of the world we live in. In the FETL board, we sometimes talk about the VUCA world we live in. It's a favourite phrase of Mike Smith, who you see in a moment. So VUCA, we live in a world that's volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous. And I think there's no doubt that those of us who are leaders in the sector know that a different style of leadership's called for, certainly different from the one that most of us, I think, grew up with after incorporation in the 1990s, when definitely, I think, heroic leadership felt like the right way to lead. I think a number of us are looking for a new leadership style, and there are various voices, of which Jim's one, I think, pointing us into the various directions in which we might look. Certainly also, Jim, you'll get no argument from me about the value of FE, but also about the complex system of interdependence, the connectedness of the world that we live in. And on a personal note, I think one of the things that resonated for me is, in my college, I've very consciously over the last few years been stepping back and giving staff the space to decide for themselves their direction of travel, sometimes making mistakes, sometimes not, but resisting my own temptation to micromanage, which I always prefer to do because I know so much better. But I think that stepping back has begun to release enormous amounts of creativity and energy. So it was definitely the right thing to do. And I realise, I think, that there is a number of stages that I think I can follow based on what Jim said really about enrolment, conversation, containment. I need to reflect more on that. Containment and reframing, again, I think resonated with me because just yesterday I read someone's taken VUCA and changed it from volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous to vision, understanding, clarity and agility. Now, I think you can always mess about with acronyms. It's quite good fun because it makes you feel you're doing something positive. But behind that, I think there's something about the importance of reframing. The world is quite a difficult place to live in at the moment. And I think reframing things, it's the old thing of changing threats to opportunities, I think is something that will take our world of further education forward. So it's left me with quite a lot to reflect on, which of course is really appropriate because what FETL's about is giving us space to think, space to reflect.
I was trying to make a distinction. I mean, empowerment is often comes with a kind of devaluation of the organization. Comes oftentimes, not always. I have no idea how you use it. It often comes with the idea that somehow the organization forms kind of shackles on people. And they have to be freed from these shackles to exercise their passion and their creativity. Well, I'm uncomfortable with that way of thinking. I'm not implying that you think that way, but I'm uncomfortable with it. So I think that exactly the reverse needs to be true because it's only through shared purpose, shared meaning, that organizations really get things done. And so I think it's a question of bringing people back into their roles in ways which are vitalizing rather than trying to free them. But again, this is just subtle language differences. And in terms of self-managing teams, I know this has been around for a while now. And so often what happens is people try experiments and they seem to work in whatever organic place they are, and then they get turned into techniques. And sort of they get turned into solutions to problems. And I think the solution, I mean, I think they're trying to address, these things trying to address some problem in the nature of authority relations in a given place. And I think sometimes things like self-managing teams or quality circles or continuous improvement, Sigma 6 and so forth. I mean, they're all brilliant and very intelligent. And sometimes people jump to them as prescriptions without really doing the work of the diagnosis. You wouldn't want your doctor to give you a prescription without doing the diagnosis. And I think sometimes this is what happens with these methods and techniques. They're very powerful, but they can often be used this way, and that they miss the underlying issues that are needing to be expressed. Leaders inevitably betray. I don't mean it in a venal sense about corruption or exploitation. I mean it in the sense that leaders sit on that boundary between the inside and the outside, and that they're working on the inside with complicated relationships. Many of them have implicit agreements built into them and loyalties and so forth. And we hear so much about the importance of loyalty and commitment. At the same time, leaders sometimes are faced with betraying people in the service of a higher purpose. This is not meant to be not meant to be an excuse for throwing people under the bus. But it is true that leaders do have to betray sometimes to have fidelity to the higher purpose of their organizations. And in that article, I made the argument that one of the saddest of all capabilities of leadership is learning and knowing how to betray without either going crazy yourself or driving other people crazy.